Hey guys, this is Echo Soundworks, and you're checking out a Serum tip and trick tutorial video on ADSR. So I'm going to show you how to create a Marimba Pluck sound inside of Serum. It sounds like this. Right, so first things first, I am going to include the wavetable so you can download it because this wavetable was a pain in the butt to make. It didn't come from a sample, that's why it's so clean sounding. It's basically you just start out with some really kind of like an organ buzzy, almost like a organ meets the harpsichord type sound, I want to say. And it's really buzzy, and we'll look at that in a second. And then it just slowly progresses and moves into a unstable sine wave right there into just a pure sine function at the end, right? And that's the bulk of the sound. So before we get going with actually recreating, I want you to actually get some useful sound design tips and tricks from this video as opposed to just seeing how I create this thing. I want to go through this actual finished sound right now, which is this. I want to talk about the key elements that are making it sound like marimba. Well, first, it's this wavetable. Right? If I turn everything off, the other oscillators, and we will turn off all of the effects as well. Right? It still sounds like a marimba. Well, what's happening here is this LFO is modulating through it, right? If we take off this or bypass this LFO, there's the first frame, right? Like I said, it's buzzy. So a marimba sound is going to go from real bright in your face, and as it tails out, it's going to lose that and kind of gets more of like a sine function going. Right? And that's just a sine wave. And this is a little bit of a dirtier sine wave. So if you wanted to try to create your own sine wave and kind of mess around with this, you can go into your wavetable editor and you can start to draw in some different bins here, and you can get sounds that are pretty close to what I started with. So let's take this one up. I want that one down. Let's take off the unison. Let's take off the quantize. Right, and we can add a little bit of dirt to it, and a little bit of higher content by going further out into the bins. But that's essentially what I did. I just played around with it, made a few different wavetables that then I copied that. So then the second wavetable, I would kind of take some of these different points down. And so as it progressed over time, right, we just got this slight change. I did too much in that example, so let's take it back. Right, so that's just a little bit of a change. So then when you modulate through it, you get a real, an actual sound. But that's the first thing. The second thing is you can obviously hear how important the effects are in the sound. Right, if we take those off, you're gonna hear quite a bit of difference. Let's turn it down real quick. Right, so hyper, dimension, chorus, compressor, delay, reverb, EQ, and filter. Those are all really contributing to the sound. Well, enough of that. Let's get into actually recreating the patch. So I have an instance of Serum right here with simply just the marimba wavetable loaded in. So download that, and then you guys can get started. So right now it's going to sound nothing like a marimba. What we're going to do first is we're going to take an LFO and we're going to just do a simple ramp up, and I'm going to drag and drop the LFO and modulate into my wavetable position because I need to hear this whole wavetable to actually make it sound like a marimba. So we're going to uncheck BPM and we're going to select envelope because I don't want this re-triggering. I don't want it actually acting like a typical LFO. I'm using this essentially like an envelope. So then if we play this, all right, let's get our first envelope set up. Well, anytime you're trying to recreate like a physically modeled sound, you got to think how that sound actually, is in the real world. So this shape doesn't seem very conducive, right? Like the attack is nothing. It just holds out and then drops to nothing. That's not really how sound moves through the air, and ultimately to our ears. So let's take this sustain down. turn the decay up a little, right? If you hit like a marimba, it's going to have a lot of sound right at the beginning, and it's going to consistently tail out. So then all you have to do is you just need to find a rate, essentially, with the LFO that's modulating the wavetable position 1 that sounds conducive to what you're trying to play or the actual sound. That sounds pretty good. We can slow it down a little for sure. Okay, and I turn the level up. Simple as that. Well, because this is a synth, I want to utilize some of the actual synthesis elements. I don't want to just use this as like a glorified sample playback. So, or I should say an unglorified, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to add oscillator B, and we're going to load up one of the analog wavetables here. We're going to load up, believe it's Basic Mini, and we're going to go to the second wavetable. It's kind of like this weird, almost like a triangle sine, right? It's basically just a sine function, but it's squished and has this little point. So if we just play that right now, it's really mellow, but it's got a nice buzz to it. So I'm gonna add a couple voices of unison. Let's add about 3. Let's turn the detune down. And I'm gonna apply a quantize warp mode. Just to a little bit, not a lot. The idea is to just add a little bit of buzz, a little bit of kind of higher frequency, right, with the quantize. Bring in a little bit. If we go all the way, almost all the way, it'll kind of sound like a square wave, right? Well, we don't want to do that. So I'm going to stop at around 40%, 42%. And let's turn the layer down. This is simply just we're just blending this, right? We're layering it with the main oscillator, so oscillator A. So I'm going to go into envelope 3 here, and I'm going to make a pretty short sound here. Attack at 0.5 milliseconds. The decay will go a little bit longer on the decay, maybe to about 1.9. And we're going to keep the release quite low as well. And we're just going to copy and paste, or not copy and paste, we're going to drag and drop that into the level of oscillator B. So let's listen to this. And then we'll dial it back as we need. So the reason I'm doing this is I want very little release on this sound. I want it playing when the actual marimba sound plays, but I want the release of oscillator A and subsequently envelope 1 to be what you hear as the release. All right, let's go to the noise oscillator, and I added, I believe it was a snare sound, oddly enough. I just liked the timbre, the kind of the texture it made, so I went to Attacks Miscellaneous, and it is the Icon Snare B, and just simply layered this with it. It had an interesting sound, so I turned the pitch down a little bit, turn it down to about 45%, and let's turn the level down a little. And let's set it to 1 shot. And I'm going to use envelope 2 to modulate this. So we're going to turn the level down a little bit. We're going to have a really short sound. I want this happening pretty much only at the attack, right? So that's at about 40 on modulation depth. All right, so that's the bulk of the sound. The next thing we need to do is filter and effects, but the filter and the effects really do add to kind of the realness and also just kind of the cool factor. So let's go to the filter. I'm going to choose a multi-stage filter so I can get both a low pass and a high pass occurring at the same time. So I can remove any of the lows that I want and I can filter out any highs that I want. So with this, it's going to be quite simple. We want to route A and B into the sound. We're going to leave the noise running free. We don't want that going into the filter. So I'm just going to take out a little bit of the highs here. There's a little bit too much because it's coming from a synth. And we're going to turn the resonance up just a little bit. We're going to keep the mix where it is. Now this is, you can change this. Like this filter doesn't, make or break the sound. It makes it a little less buzzy, which is nice. All right, so that's all pretty much done. The next thing we're going to do is we are going to basically just add some effects. Let's go to our effects tab. And the first thing we're going to do is add some hyper and dimension. We're going to turn on the hyper and dimension, but we're going to add very little of the actual hyper, right? Very, very little. So I'm just add a couple voices here to about 10%. And then let's add about 10% on the mix of the dimension and turn the size down to about 25%. Let's just take this up to about 15. All right, so that's a pretty cool sound. Now the next sound that I added when I actually made the patch was a compressor. That'll be one of the first things I add to a sound, unless it's going to be some, I'm thinking of using the multiband. But I typically want to compress the sound quite early in the process of my effects processing. So with the compressor, pretty simple. We crank the threshold up pretty high in the patch. I believe it was around 30, 35. The ratio is set to 4:1, which is what the default is. The attack, we turn the attack down a little bit, right? This is a pretty plucky sound. So let's take this down to about 25, 26. The release kept where it was. And the mix, I turned the mix down a little bit for a parallel processing vibes just to around 65, 60, around there. And then let's turn the gain to kind of compensate for the reduction in volume that we're getting. And this will add a little bit of snap to it. Let's turn that down to about 4.5. All right, so now let's load up. I used next I used the chorus effect, and I actually put that before the compressor. The chorus in Serum can do some pretty cool things. If you turn the rate down really low, so we had this, I think I had it at about, I think it was basically 0, right? There's this pretty big range of the knob. If you notice this, here's 0. I'm still at 0, and I've moved the knob up quite a bit, right? So I had it at like the higher end of 0. This actually does have a slight difference in the sound if you have it all the way down or kind of right here. So we're going to take it to the higher end of 0, which sounds weird to say. The delay 1 I had with the default. The depth, I turned the depth down a little bit. I turned the low pass filter up a little as well, and I turned the mix down. So let's listen to this if I crank the mix up. It's a pretty cool sound. So I had the mix around 60, 65%, somewhere in there. Now next I added a little bit of delay, and the delay happens after the compressor, and I just filtered out some of the highs, kept it on quarter note, and I turned the mix down. And the feedback down a little as well. All right, the next effect is really important in the sound. It's the reverb. So I use the reverb to soften the sound, add some space, which adding the space really helps add the release that we added to envelope 1 and actually make it sound more like a marimba. So I had I used the Hall algorithm. The size was around 25 to 30%. This is mainly something you're going to be doing to taste though. So let's go 25. The decay was at, I think, around 4 to 5 seconds. The low cut was, we'll keep that where it is. The spin, I turned down the spin just a little bit, and the spin depth, I actually turned up to around 20, 23%, I think, and then the mix, just do that to taste. All right, now the next two effects will be EQ and filter. So with this, I kept it on the first setting here, right? The low EQ type. And we're going to turn the frequency down a little bit. Turn the Q up just about 70%. And let's turn the gain down, right? Just so we're getting a little bit of reduction in the lows. And I'm going to add a little bit of high to it, right? So the Q, pretty much keep where it is. The frequency, you want it around 1500 hertz. We don't want to go too high, right? So should look something like that. right, then finally, I added a comb filter. The comb filter is a great filter to kind of create physically modeled instruments, right? And this specific one is a great one for like flutes and synthesized kind of tropical house flutes, that sort of stuff. So I used it to soften up some of the frequencies here, make it sound more like a synth. So I turned the sound up quite high, or the cutoff up quite high, the resonance about 60%, added a little bit of drive, probably around 8%, no more than 10. So let's keep it at about, let's do 10%. And the mix I had at about 90. Right, that makes a huge difference on the sound. It's thick now. All right, then finally, let's finish this up by adding that second envelope onto the cutoff of our filter. And there you guys have it. That is a pretty easy way to create a good marimba pluck in Serum. And like I said, you can quickly turn this into a much darker sound. If we just go to the reverb right now, let's turn the size down, let's turn the mix up. Right now, it's more tailored probably for something for hip hop. It sounds a little bit weird on the. Sounds a little bit interesting on the setting that we have, or the MIDI that I'm playing is so happy and kind of bright, but. Right, so it's a great patch to have in your arsenal. If you guys have any questions or comments, let me know below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I'm Echo Soundworks. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.